Now, Rosie Duffield, who Helen has just referenced there on the People's Panel, the Labour MP for Canterbury, joins me now. Thank you very much for coming into the studio, Rosie. Now, let's have your reaction, first of all, to Nicola Sturgeon's resignation. She claims it wasn't about recent pressures over this trans issue. What do you think?
Lots of journalists have been talking about what a shock it was, but in Parliament we've been talking about it for a few weeks. Certainly in my circles of women, we've been saying, that's it, game over, because it was such an unpopular bill to try and introduce, and I think it was 80% of the country were against what she was trying to push through. It was inevitable with things like that, and then there's some issues over finances, I think, isn't there?
Yes.
That all of it would have come together. And
I mean, she talked about the brutality of politics and how life had been difficult for her, which I'm sure you can sympathise with because you've had a lot of abuse yourself over this issue. But actually, she just unravelled over the notion of putting this double rapist in a women's prison, didn't she?
Yeah, I think it was all a complete disaster, PR-wise, and she was sort of doubling down and not prepared, didn't look as though she was prepared to think again and accept some of those amendments, and that would have been a real problem, I think, for her.
Should that bill die a death now, whoever takes over the SNP?
I think it needs serious looking at again, yeah, and the government have said, haven't they, they've invoked this Section 35 and they've effectively stopped it, so it really needs to start again, I think, or be scrapped completely.
Let's talk about the abuse that you faced for standing up for women in the Houses of Parliament. I think we've actually got a clip of you being heckled by your own MPs. Let's just have a look at that now.
I welcome the government's invoking of Section 35 in this case, as the bill clearly conflicts with the Equality Act and would have repercussions for women across the UK.
So you had you there being heckled by Ben Bradshaw and Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Yeah.
Have they apologised for that?
No. Lloyd messaged me saying that he'd been told not to message me and that his life had been made really difficult since then. He'd experienced lots of abuse and things, but it certainly wasn't an apology.
And Ben Bradshaw?
No, not at all. No, nothing from him.
Tell me, has Keir Starmer spoken to you about any of this lately? No. When's the last time you spoke to the Labour leader?
I've had one meeting with Keir and it was September 2021.
So you haven't spoken to him at all? He hasn't offered any support in light of what you've had to go through because of this? I mean, what's the state of play with regard to you? I know you had some terrible issues. You'd received death threats. You're getting a lot of online abuse about your stance on trans. Yeah. He hasn't spoken to you about that at all?
No. No.
And what's your reaction to him on that? I mean,
when Keir stood for the leadership, he made great play to the MPs about how he had run an organisation. He was really in touch with his staff. He was very hands-on, and I thought that sounded great. But there's 195 Labour MPs with the whip at the moment, and not very many get the headlines and the kind of vitriol that I get. I mean, we all get horrible abuse, but it's been particularly horrible for me. It would have been nice, I think, if he'd just messaged me or something.
But then, let's put it from some of your critics. There are people in the Labour LGBTQ plus group that claim you're transphobic. Yeah. Are you, Rosie?
Absolutely not. In a million years. I mean, why would I or anyone hate a group of people, you know, simply because they've got this gender dysphoria issue or, you know, issues about their gender and sexuality? It's impossible for me to understand how people think I hate those people. I'm talking about women's rights. Trans rights are the same as every other human right, I hope, and they should be. And I have every sympathy for anyone going through those things. But women's rights sometimes clash with self-ID, and that's what women like me are talking about.
And why do you think it is that a very well-educated man such as Keir Starmer struggles to answer this question about whether women can or cannot have a penis?
I think it's a brand new thing for us to be talking about as politicians. There's an awful lot of reading to do. He has to be all over all of the subjects, and this one is particularly difficult. And I think if you've got the same group of activists who are very influential in the party, bombarding you with information, then perhaps it is easy to get completely hoodwinked or only listen to one point of view. I don't know.
But would you like to see more leadership on this issue from the Labour leader?
Yeah. I would.
What would you like him to say?
I'd like him to address women. I'd like him to meet more regularly with women's groups. Labour Women's Declaration, for example, are a group of about 8,000 women who've signed a pledge saying they want an end to self-ID and they want single-sex spaces being protected. That's 8,000 Labour members, councillors, activists, voters. I think it would be a good idea to listen to them more.
Why do you think he's sitting on the fence?
I think because we're desperate to get into government and it's a very difficult issue. And I think as I said, I think he's advised by a lot of people based in London, a lot of people very active in the Labour Party. I think if you talk to the wider country, there are different points of view, and I think it would be a good idea to hear all of them.
Helen, on the People's panel there, wanted me to ask you whether you think that Labour has a woman problem.
Certainly, as far as I've experienced it since I became an MP, I would say, yeah, there is a bit of a women problem.
I mean, when Bradshaw and Lloyd, Russell-Moyle sort of shouted at you in the House, I mean, how did that make you feel? Do you feel you're being... I don't want to put words into your mouth, but is there a bit of bullying going on here? How do you characterise it?
It immediately feels... I mean, all women have had abuse. We know harassment when we see it, especially women of my age group. We've had it all of our lives in different ways, and it just feels like it felt as though they were just trying to shut me up. And that's not a great look, I don't think, from Labour MPs.
No, I'm just going to quote something back to you that you said. You said in 2019, it was hard enough trying to convince my constituents that Labour wasn't anti-Semitic. In the next election, when they inevitably ask whether Labour is sexist, I'm not sure I'll be able to do the same. Do you agree with that premise? Do you think Labour are sexist?
There's lots of evidence that makes me feel that the party has got a bit of a women problem. There was a recent, I think it was a few days ago, a breakdown of the leaders' roles within the Labour Party. Yes, we've got some really great women on the shadow cabinet and the front bench, but leadership roles like General Secretary, Head of Staff, Head of Comms, all of those kind of things, and our leader, they're all still white men based in London.
So Labour aren't really practising what they preach?
Well, it's hard to sort of see that we are, the leader talks about how we've got over 50% of women MPs, but those are the women that clung on. In 2019,
yes.
We did that. That wasn't by design, actually. And we've managed to keep hold of our seats in the worst general election defeat that we've ever known. So credit to us, I think.
Brief word on Corbyn. I think Keir Starmer deserves credit for flushing out a lot of the anti-Semitism in the party.
Yeah.
Corbyn's departure, I mean, in your view, was he an anti-Semite?
He certainly led a party that had a serious anti-Semitism problem, yeah.
Him individually?
I don't know his views individually, but he didn't do enough as leader.